the deaths and mutilations of at least 36
Information
women.
we have is that Bundy has now confessed to yet another murder.
Earlier in this newscast, Theodore Bundy is still at large at this hour. Sandy Gilmore's just returned from the
Ease
scene.
that has so far baffled police and left most co-eds here
High in
terrified.
excitement to the stalking and killing is the power that you exert over others.
Blanket statement that I'm innocent. No man is truly innocent. I mean, we all have transgressed in some way in our lives. And as I say, I've been impolite, and there are things I regret having done in my life.
In Washington State, in 1974, there's a huge search for a serial killer that goes by the name Ted. But what the public doesn't know at the time, that the killer amongst them is Ted Bundy, who's working his way into double digits with women he's murdered. When Ted leaves his home in 74, away from family and friends, and the woman he loves with their daughter, that Ted has been somewhat raising as a father, it's a sad moment for everyone to accept that Ted is leaving, but they believe what Ted is telling them, that he's just wanting to continue his education, going into law, and that's why he's going to Utah. You have to understand where Ted is at this moment with his story. When he leaves home, even more unknown stories take place, from sightings, women he murdered, or women that he's believed to have murdered. Understand that when Ted leaves to go to Utah, it's one of the biggest murder sprees in American history in such a short time, and still to this day, we really don't even know all the victims. This part of Ted's story has many holes in it. He's technically on the run, unbeknownst to anyone. Now that Ted is on his way to Utah, he has no place to take bodies, to have them for days on end, to play out his fantasies, performing necrophilia, or just dismembering the bodies. This side of Ted murdering is different. He's never comfortable again and becomes more careless, but doubles the amount of women that he's already killed in a short time. And it literally all starts while driving to Utah. When Ted was alone in his car, driving, the compulsion and the urge must have been piercing through his hands and his body to know that he's all alone. No one knows where he's at, no one knows who he is, and finding victims will be exciting to him. When Ted leaves for Utah, Liz and her friend take this picture of Ted, his Volkswagen that he had many of his victims in, his bike that he would ride to the crime scenes the next day or to visit the bodies without being seen, and clothes on that he more than likely wore while taking someone's life or tricking them. What you're seeing in this picture is very eerie because it's what many people saw for the last time ever. Ted Bundy looking preppy, harmless, with his Volkswagen. When Ted first enters Utah, he admits to picking up a hitchhiker. He debated with himself whether or not to pick her up and acting out his usual desires. But he stops, picks her up. He admits to the person that he's telling the story to that he doesn't want to hear the girl speak. He doesn't want conversation. It ruins the mood. What is known from this victim's story is that Ted drives her to a wooded area, the young girl knowing what's happening. She's crying and screaming for her life, begging to be let go. The same words that Ted has heard many times before from his past victims. At first, Ted tells her that everything's going to be okay and she's going to be fine, but he knows this is a lie. He assaults her and takes her life. This victim is one of Ted's many Jane Does. It's believed that Ted had a few Jane Does when he first went to Utah from other hitchhikers. There's another moment when Ted talks of a hitchhiker in Utah trying to remember what the young girl even looked like, saying he had no idea who she was, but that he buried her on top of a rocky hillside, then piled rocks on top of her grave, not far from the road. But much like Ted's Jane Does, they have something in common with the victims that we have identified from Ted. Most of their remains, if any, have never been found. The last hitchhiker we know that Ted took was in Idaho. Ted would confess to this murder before his death. The girl is still unknown. No picture, no age, no remains. It was just a memory that Ted thought of the last moment. Ted gave the short version that he picked her up, assaulted her, choked her to death, and hid her body in a wooded area. He liked something about her so much so that he came back to take pictures of her. This was an element that Ted acted out sometimes. We have no proof of it, but Ted swears that he did take pictures of corpses. Those pictures would come back up later in his story. He then tore her body apart, throwing it in the nearby river. When Ted makes it to Utah, he has a house that he rents half of. The house still stands today where Ted found it, in Salt Lake City, which would be the new hunting grounds for Ted for a short time, and his new social group of friends. When Ted gets into town, he does what Ted does. He finds friends. Some he finds at school that he doesn't attend too much, and just some from dinner parties. Now that Ted is in his new home, he develops new ways of tracking and taking women. He's much more careless. In the second half of Ted's murder spree, he simply just takes, but still stalking and looking for victims. He's not so much focusing on college girls, but now looks for anyone that fits his interests. And the majority of Ted's new victims are teenage girls. We do know from victims' families that when Ted got into Salt Lake City, he started to talk to girls around the city, keeping tabs on where they worked, where they were hanging out with friends. We know that he did this with a handful of the victims that would first disappear around Utah. So much so that many of the girls knew him before he would take them. They even told friends and their siblings about a man named Ted who was in law school that they had been talking to or showing interest in them. But not all the girls liked Ted, and one of his first victims in Utah was no exception. With Ted already being in Salt Lake City, he wastes no time to find his next victim, and that is Nancy Wilcox. Nancy was 16 when she was taken on October 2nd, 1974. Nancy's story is interesting for one particular reason. Ted remembers her. When he's asked about Nancy, when he's confessing to murders, he remembers Nancy, which is somewhat odd because Ted seems to give more detail about Nancy in particular. But when Ted is confessing to this murder, on 2 different occasions, he gives 2 different accounts of her abduction. Many think Ted was mixing up Nancy with someone else, or he was just playing games. But to get this story straight to the point of what happened, Ted said he remembers he was in a bad state in his mind when he took Nancy. More than likely, he was in town and his impulse was driving him mad. We now know that a friend of Nancy's was told by Nancy that she had been talking to a man that had been coming into where she worked for a couple weeks. The friend would say that Nancy told her that this older man was in law school, always asking her questions. It's not confirmed, but it's believed heavily that this was Ted grooming Nancy. Nancy's sister would recall, right before Nancy disappeared, that there was a day when Nancy was sitting in front of the living room window. Nancy, looking out of the window, stood up and pointed and said, "That's the man I've been talking to at work. He just drove past our house." Ted was stalking Nancy. He knew where she worked, and he now knew where she lived. When Ted does take Nancy, there's 2 different stories at 2 different times when Ted talks about Nancy, about where he took her body, but the one that is most believed goes like this. On October 2nd of 74, Nancy would walk out of her house in the dark, going to the store up the road. She would vanish. More than likely, Ted had made up his mind, knowing that Nancy would leave the house from time to time at night. He was hunting her. It wasn't by chance that he just happened to pick up Nancy that night. He saw her walk out of her front door and walk up the street by herself in the dark. Ted pulls up to Nancy, jumps out, holding a knife, and forces her into the car and drives off. Ted drives right down the road into an orchard where he ties up Nancy. He then takes her back to his apartment for the night. Nancy's last moments here on Earth are terrifying. She's assaulted and beaten all night, tied up. Ted doesn't go into detail, and it sounds like he doesn't want to go into detail about how he took Nancy's life, but more than likely choked her or drowned her in his bathtub, a method that he would start to adapt. From there, when Ted's talking about Nancy, his memory loses track of exactly what he did to Nancy's body, but it's believed after Nancy was at the apartment all night, Ted eventually loaded her corpse back up in his Volkswagen, drove 200 miles away to another orchard, and buried her body. Ted is obviously not wanting anybody to find Nancy. It's his first murder in town. He goes above and beyond of getting rid of her corpse. Nancy's body has never been found. Not a fingernail, not a hair, not a piece of bone. Still to this day, no one knows where she's at. 16 days later, Ted is hunting and finds his next victim. It's a disturbing murder. Melissa Smith, 17. She would disappear on October 18th of 74. Melissa's case is special for one particular sense. Unlike 90% of Ted's victims, Melissa's body is found. This is her story. Not much detail is known about exactly what he did to her, but more than likely, it was the same scenario of Nancy. On that night in October, at around 10 p.m., Melissa would leave a pizza restaurant where she was with a friend. Melissa was planning on staying with a friend that night, but it fell through, so she just decided to walk home. After eating pizza, she gets up, walks out of the restaurant, and down the street. She starts walking into a dark neighborhood, finding a friend's house. She stays there for almost 30 minutes, talking to the friend, to where eventually she says goodnight and walks off. This is the last time Melissa is ever seen alive. She walks off into the dark neighborhood. Melissa's story is still not known in detail to this day. Audio, or really a transcript of what Ted said about her, has never been released, but is still believed to be recorded somewhere, deep in files that have not been released. All we know is that Ted found her that night. We're not even sure if he was stalking her or just driving around and happened to come up on her. But either way, Ted was looking for someone that night. He pulls up on Melissa, gets her into his car, and all we can guess is that more than likely he took her back to his apartment once again. 9 days later, Melissa would be found off the side of a road, face down on a hillside of dirt. She was found by 2 hunters. She was naked. She had a nylon sock around her neck. Her head was bludgeoned. She had been assaulted. An autopsy showed that she had been beaten as well. She was 23 miles away from her home. Her death was extremely brutal. We do see signs, though, that Ted was getting sloppy, as he didn't bury her, and he left evidence, a nylon sock tied around Melissa still. October 31st, 74. Laura Amy, 17, would be Ted's next victim. Laura's case is interesting itself as well. The story has many facts that are true, and some that are still guesses today. To add a little color to where Ted is in his own story right at this moment for Laura, something that we will find out from her story is that we now know and can confirm that even going back to Nancy Wilcox weeks earlier, Ted's still freshly in Salt Lake City. We know that Ted was driving and walking around his local community more than most people ever would, learning the landscapes, but also Ted was going to places where young women were, where he knew he could find them, restaurants where young people would hang out, parks, and most importantly, high schools. We know that Ted first came into contact with Laura at her own school. This would later come out with Laura's friends, that they said they saw a man walk up to her a week prior, talking to her, that had dark hair. Also, before Laura disappeared, she would have another run-in with Ted at the local park with a few of her friends, which is how the story would make its way out later on. It's said that Ted came up to the pack of friends, pinpointing on Laura especially, trying to talk to her, just making small talk, even saying that Laura was agitated somewhat, because at this point, the group of friends knew who Ted was, that he was an older man that was occasionally appearing where the friends were, especially when Laura was around. But this is where Laura disappears. On that Halloween night, we know that Laura was at a party that night, but it's still unclear if she was taken at the party or afterwards. Many different stories have come from this night. It's also believed that she left the party that night, went to a cafe, and people saying that they saw her. From there, she vanishes and disappeared there, being picked up by Ted. When Ted talks about Laura's case, he gives no detail about when, where, how he picked her up, but somehow she would end up in Ted's Volkswagen that night. Laura's body would not be found until November 26, Thanksgiving Day. She was found by 2 hitchhikers at American Fork Canyon on the side of an embankment next to a small river, right along a loud stream of water next to the road. She was found naked and kept unspoiled due to the cold weather. When her autopsy is performed, the report will show that she had been beaten, assaulted, a sodomy performed, and strangled to death, but also somewhere bludgeoned as well. And when she's found, like the other victims, she still has a stocking tied around her neck. The report would also show something interesting, that her time of death was hard to pinpoint. She had been missing longer than she had been dead. It's believed that Ted kept Laura in his apartment for a few days alive, torturing her every day. Laura's body, when found, would be a Jane Doe at first, her face badly beaten. Her body was finally identified when her parents would show up at the morgue, and her father, personally, identified her. Laura's case still has many holes in it today. It's even proven that much of the evidence was destroyed at the time by just mishandling. She was one of the last victims Ted confessed to, and really all we know is, from Ted, is that he said he took her. All of the evidence and stories have come from other people around her at the time. The next abduction that Ted would try was just a week later. Ted would try to take Carol DeRanch around 7 p.m. that day while she was shopping at the local mall. Ted had obviously been stalking Carol before she even walked in the mall. She had a bright red Camaro. More than likely, she was a target somewhere on the road. He knew what car she was driving and where she was parked. He walks up to Carol in the mall while she's standing outside of a bookstore. Ted would approach Carol, telling her that he was a police officer and that someone had broken into her vehicle. Ted described what her car looked like, model, color, where it was, and even showing her a badge that he had. Carol believed him, but also said that she could smell a little bit of alcohol on Ted, and also that the story did seem odd with how Ted looked and the smell of alcohol. But she would walk with Ted out of the mall into the parking lot to where Ted would guide her to what he called a substation across the street, right near a laundromat. As Ted would go to grab the handle of what he called the substation, seeing that it was locked, he then turns to Carol and says that we need to go to the police station and you can ride with me down to it. She saw the Volkswagen, seeing that it had no passenger seat. Maybe that made it look more of a police car to her. But either way, she said it was odd, but got in the Volkswagen. And within a few minutes, she knew she had made a deep mistake. Ted was not talking anymore, and his posture was changing. Ted suddenly pulls the Volkswagen over to a parking lot next to a school. He then leaps onto Carol, getting one handcuff around her arm. Carol starts to fight off Ted, pushing him. It's broad daylight. Somehow, miraculously, she jumps out of the car with the handcuff still on one of her arms, runs across the parking lot screaming for people to help. An older couple sees her. She jumps in their vehicle. Ted, who's already jumped out of the Volkswagen, running after Carol with a crowbar in his hand, turns back. He knows that people can see him, and Ted simply drives away. Carol is saved, but her story would continue. It's a fatal mistake by Ted. But the day isn't done. On the same day and night, the same hour, Ted is still in the hunt for anyone that he can fulfill his desire for. He wasn't going home empty-handed. Ted would end up at Viewmont High School, where he would be seen by many people that night. At this point, Ted's desires have fully taken over. He's sloppy and doesn't care about evidence. When Ted drives to the school, he's more than likely in the hopes that there would be high school girls hanging out late at night that he could easily pick up. But when he arrived, he would be shocked to find that there was an event in the auditorium late that night, and people were showing up. Ted would first come into contact with a woman named Raylan. She was stopped by Ted in the hallway of the school, right by the auditorium. He first tells her that she has beautiful eyes, but then Ted would ask her to help him out in the parking lot. Raylan would politely say she didn't have time to help Ted, but also, like Carol DeRanch, she could smell alcohol on Ted and became uncomfortable. Ted was persistent that it would only take a few minutes if he would just follow her outside in the parking lot. It's dark. Raylan politely says no again. She walked off, But 15 minutes later, she said she would come back down the hallway again to see Ted. She would walk right past him and say hi, to where she said Ted would completely ignore her. But one last time, the two would run into each other again and have another small conversation, where Ted continued to insist that he needed her help out in the parking lot. Luckily, Raylan is not peer pressured, and by this time she's with her husband and goes to sit down with him. Ted backs off at this point. Also at the school and in the crowd that night is Susan Curtis, who will sadly have her own run-in with Ted later in the story. Ted will see someone else that night though, and her name is Deborah Kent, 17. Deborah's there with her parents. They walk into the auditorium and sit down. Somewhere in there, Ted spots her. More than likely, he's watching a few girls that night, waiting to see if they get up. The play gets underway, and around 10 o'clock that night, Deborah's parents ask her to go to the car and go pick up her brothers at a skating rink. So Deborah politely does what her parents ask. She gets up and walks out of the auditorium. Witnesses will later say that they did see a man walk out right behind her. She walks outside to the cold parking lot in the dark. She's parked around the side of the building. It's in a bad spot. She's by herself, or so she thinks. More than likely, somehow Ted sneaks up on her. A nearby cop will later make a statement that he heard a woman scream loudly twice, but also that he hears a man yell one time. Ted will put handcuffs on Deborah, and what sounds like to be a fight, pushes her in the Volkswagen, but in the panic, Ted would drop the key to the handcuffs that will later be found and be the only piece of evidence in the whole case. Ted would give an audio statement that has been released of little details of him taking Deborah. Once again, Ted does the same MO. He takes Deborah back to his apartment. He says he keeps her there for 24 hours, but he says she's only alive for 12 hours at the apartment. Ted gives no detail of what he did to Deborah. He said he didn't want to get into it. Maybe another time, he says, just wanting to focus on where the body was. The next night, he loads her corpse into his car and drives over 100 miles away to a remote canyon. Ted talks about the dark road, the bumpiness of it, but saying too that you'd be surprised where you could take a Volkswagen. After all that time, Ted still remembered the road, the big iron gate he had to open, giving great detail of where he took Deborah that night. So much so that Deborah's parents would go back to that spot 15 years later and find a piece of her bone. Many believe that this is where Ted also took Nancy Wilcox, but Ted's memory of Nancy was not the best of where he took her body, giving a few different accounts. From that moment, Ted takes a little break. Liz, Ted's girlfriend, and her daughter Molly are in town and visiting Ted. Ted has to be on good behavior. These pictures right here are of Ted of that very moment, before anyone knows that Ted is a serial killer, before anyone knows that he's been hunting down women, torturing them, and doing unbelievable acts on their body. The three spend time together, seeing sights, and simply just being around each other again. Ted was essentially like Molly's father. She loved him, and Liz also missed Ted and loved him dearly. It's also known now that Liz was becoming very uncomfortable with Ted always holding Molly, tickling her aggressively. Weird behavior Liz was seeing from Ted that played into her suspicions already. Molly herself years later would say and would confirm that Ted had been inappropriate with her, slipping his hands around her in places that it shouldn't be and walking in on her when she was in the bathroom multiple times. There's no doubt that Ted was going through his own struggles, trying not to harm Molly. But also what Ted doesn't know at this very moment is that before he left Washington, Liz did have her suspicions that Ted could have been the killer in town, even calling in a tip on him that went nowhere. And now that she's in town with Ted, she's aware of all the missing girls in the same area where Ted's living, and the same suspect has black hair and a Volkswagen. But in this time, the community is safe for one little minute due to Ted being held up by Liz and Molly while they spend the holidays together. Ted is living his life all while killing women in his new town. He's joined the Mormon church. He's been baptized. He's becoming popular, making friends. It's even rumored, but not confirmed, that Ted was having one-night stands with local women as well. that he would have in social groups. And believe it or not, Ted was throwing dinner parties at his apartment for large groups of friends, the same apartment where he's kept women days on end, torturing them and murdering them. He's also in school, even though he only attends class for the first semester 3 times. To people around him, Ted looks like a wonderful person that men want as a friend and women look at as a future husband. But Ted's break doesn't last long. His next victim is Karen Campbell, 23 years old and a registered nurse. Karen's case is special and is a change-up of what Ted has been doing lately in Utah. This is the case that would come to haunt Ted on January 12, 1975 in Aspen. From a single hair that was found in Ted's car that was microscopically proven to be Karen's hair. Karen, who is with her fiancé and their children, are on a trip from Michigan to Aspen, and now Karen finds herself at the Wildwood Lodge. She's such a long way from home. It's cold outside, snow along the roads. On this day, Karen's already been busy. She's been skiing with the kids, then having some fun shopping afterwards, and having a nice dinner with her family. It's now late into the day, and Karen, she's not feeling well, sick to the stomach. She says she believes she's getting sick. When the family's back at the lodge that night, they rest in the lobby, next to the fire, coffee, and hot chocolate. Karen sits on the fireplace stoop. When she does, she realizes she left her magazine back up in her room. She wants it, but doesn't want to go get it. She asks her fiancé, but he says no. The two get in a small argument, just a little fluster, so Karen stands up and says she'll be back momentarily. I'm going to get my magazine. She walks out of the lobby, and within seconds, she's met by Ted. We know this because the magazine was still right where she left it, in the hotel room. Somewhere Ted found her. He never talks about how he took her, but that he is responsible for her death. Ted more than likely was watching Karen. It's highly unlikely he just bumped into her at that split second. He was probably in the lobby with her. When she got up, he got up and walked out right behind her, or was waiting for her out in the parking lot, just by the chance that she would come out by herself, or someone else that he was watching. More than likely he pulled a trick on her, the broken arm trick, needing help with his vehicle, but somehow he took Karen. Almost a month later, someone walking along the road sees a large group of birds covering the ground and flying over an object. As they walk up to it, it's the body of Karen. Her corpse was mostly intact, other than what wildlife had already picked away. When her autopsy is done, it seemed that Karen had 3 large fractures right on her skull, and food was still in her stomach. It was determined that she had only been alive for 2 hours from the time she ate to the time she died. Ted did not keep Karen alive long. The case of Karen Campbell would come back up and be a big problem for Ted. It's believed that Ted did not murder anyone in February of 1975. At least still, that cannot be proven or pinpointed down to. On March 1st of 1975, 2 forestry students would be hiking through the deep wooded area of Taylor Mountain near a service road that led into another back road of a forest. As the 2 students are walking through the middle of the forest, they start to see clothing. They find clumps of hair, to eventually finding bones that lead to skulls. The remains of Ted's first victims in Washington, his first big dumping site, Taylor Mountain, has now been found. The site makes headlines, and once again the victims start to be talked about again. It's now known that one person did all of this, as all the remains were found together in one location. Although Bob Kepler would say this publicly, that when they did find the skulls, they were around each other, almost like they had been dumped, apart from the bodies. They showed the same aging from the different seasons they've already been through. Rain, snow, cold, heat, even though some of them should have been out there longer and showed a little more wear and tear. Kepler thinks that Ted kept the skulls in a place together, keeping them from spoiling in a refrigerator or in a freezer. Ted did admit to removing heads around the same time, saying not to keep for pleasure, but just to put in a different location to throw off authorities. Police are still not working with each other in different states, but it is known throughout Utah and Colorado that many girls of the same age and looks are disappearing as well. Ted's victims are starting to add up, and he's not stopping. But his next victim is on March 15th of 75, Julie Cunningham, 26, the oldest victim of Ted's that we know of. It's sadly one of the least known about murders from evidence and witnesses, but Ted does confess to the murder. He gives the account of what happened, but when Ted did admit to killing Julie, he paused and asked the question to the detective, "Did you know her?" The detective looked at Ted and said, "Yes, I knew her long ago." "How could you tell?" Ted said, "I could just see that you've become emotional about it." There's no doubt that this coincidence would hurt the interview. On that day in Vail, Colorado, Ted was hunting, driving up and down the road, around lodges, parking lots, shopping locations, just looking for anyone, someone, his same old MO. Eventually, he decides to use his rouge. Ted walks up and down the street, hobbling, as though he has a hurt knee, walking on his crutches, carrying ski boots with him. He's walking around a shopping area, but before Ted did leave his car, he placed his crowbar behind the back wheel on the passenger side, making sure he was ready. As Ted's walking down the streets, he sees Julie, who sees him, who happens to be a ski instructor herself, sees Ted at this point, acting like he's hurt and about to fall. The two of them come into contact with each other, Julie asking, can she help? So much so that Ted asks her to hold his boots and walk back with him to his vehicle. She agrees. One of the crazy parts of the confession and story is that the two of them walked half a mile back for some time together, all the while Ted hobbling in crutches. Ted said they made small talk, laughing, Julie probably even thinking that Ted was nice and attractive and liked to ski, even around the same age of each other. But when they get to the Volkswagen, Julie goes to place Ted's boots in the passenger side, while Ted drops his crutches, grabs his crowbar, hits Julie hard as he can in the back of the head, knocking her out. He then throws her into the car, handcuffs her, jumps in the driver's seat, and speeds off. An hour into the drive, Julie wakes up moaning that turns into crying, in pain, blood on her head, asking who Ted is, what he's doing, what he wants. Why are you doing this? She must have been so horrified of what was happening, but also confused. For some odd reason, Ted would say this as well, maybe to make the detective listening feel somewhat better in Ted's mind. He said that Julie asked him to loosen the handcuffs, and Ted politely did so. Ted starts looking for a side road. Either he wasn't going to make it where he wanted to go, and panicked, but he said he started to look for a side road, eventually finding one. He gets out, walks around looking to make sure everything is clear. He says he looks back at the Volkswagen, and Julie is escaping. He runs after her, grabs his crowbar. He says the both of them even get into a scuffle, but eventually Ted hits her again with his crowbar, knocking her unconscious, then grabbing a cord and strangling her to death, and then going through his usual ritual of what he's going to do with the body. Ted strips her clothing, taking everything she has, and later giving it to a Goodwill donation. Ted even says that 6 weeks later he comes back to check on the body and make sure he's left no evidence. But still to this day, even with Ted giving a detail where he left her, or so he thinks, Julie has never been found. Somewhere, she's still buried. The next victim would be a young woman named Denise, 24, Ted's last Colorado victim that we know about to be proven. This particular murder, no one even had a clue that Ted was the one that did this, and would go unsolved for over a decade. The only real evidence that is connected with Ted and Denise is that there was a young lady that went missing of the time frame of when Ted says he took someone in Grand Junction, and gas receipts that were found in Ted's possession would prove that Ted was around the location at the same time Denise disappeared. On April 6 of 75, Denise would end up in an argument with her husband. They would get into such a bickerment that Denise would walk out, needing space, get on her bike, and ride to her parents' house. When Denise leaves on a yellow bike, no one ever sees her again. As Denise is on her way to her parents', it's believed that where her bike was found, that Ted took her underneath an overpass. And really, we don't know what he did afterwards. We just know that Ted said he dumped her body in the Colorado River. Denise's bike was found the next day, underneath the overpass. When Denise disappears, no one has any clues, witnesses, nothing. She's just simply vanished. Ted is never linked to the murder, really. It's completely out of his wheelhouse, from college students and young girls. Still to this day, Denise is considered missing. Nothing of her has ever been found. Around this same time frame, there's 2 other murders that Ted is believed to have done, but it's never been proven or said by Ted that he committed the murders. It's believed that on April 15th of 75, Ted took a 15-year-old girl named Susie. She disappeared while walking home from school. She was found bludgeoned with a rock nearby. The other disappearance and murder that Ted is connected to is of a young girl, 23, named Nancy. 1975, on July 4th, would disappear while at work at a gas station. Nancy, who had a 4-year-old son, simply vanishes while working. Ted is asked while being recorded if he took Nancy, but shrugs it off and just says no. There's many more women through Utah, Idaho, Colorado that Ted is connected to, but Ted held on to them in the hopes, saving him from death. The next victim that Ted lures into his midst, it's a change to what he's been doing. Ted starts to target young girls, very young girls. At this point, Ted shows all of his cards. We now know that there's no rules. It's never too much for Ted, knowing that he's even a danger to children, and confirming the suspicions that Ted was attracted to Molly. The next person to fall for Ted's tricks is Lynette Culver. Lynette is only 12. The kidnapping takes place in Idaho. On May 5th, Ted would walk into a Holiday Inn and rent out one room in the back of the hotel, away from people and away from the street. He doesn't put the room in his name. He walks into his room, checks it out, and sets it up the way he wants it. He then gets back into his car and starts looking for someone to take. It was cold that day, more than usual, it was said, for the time of year. Ted said that he had trouble that first day finding someone to fall for his tricks, many potential victims that never took the bait, and the weather wasn't helping, making people impatient and not wanting to talk. Ted spent the whole day looking for a victim, but can't get anybody into his grips. He's defeated. He goes back to his room at the Holiday Inn. The next day, May 6, Ted gets up, anxious and wanting someone bad. He drives to the high school nearby, one he's familiar with. He waits and looks around. As Ted starts to walk around the school, he sees someone that catches his eye. It's Lynette. Lynette is walking by herself, Ted would say. Ted walks up to Lynette and starts talking to her. It's still not clear how he convinced her to walk to his car and willingly get inside. More than likely, Ted used the rouge that he was a cop. When Ted talks about Lynette, he gives lots of detail about her life, trying to convince the detectives he's talking to that he really did take her, and that he's not just pulling their chain, trying to buy time. Ted said that Lynette told him things about her personal life, talking about her grandmother, moving, her mother, her father, so much so that the detective would make a comment later on that he believed that Ted knew Lynette and had talked to her before. But it seemed as though Ted had been talking to Lynette enough to gain her trust, days, weeks, somewhere. Ted said that he peacefully got Lynette into the car, kept her calm, laughing, small talk, taking her right back to the hotel, not far away. But little after that, Ted didn't want to talk about what he did to Lynette, but only saying that he drowned her in the bathtub in his room. He then took her body and threw it into the nearby river, which would be Snake River. Lynette has never been found. When detectives are asking Ted about Lynette, something odd would happen. As the one detective talked about Lynette, he mentioned her age, saying that she was only 12 years old. When he said this, he said that Ted looked up at him and was shocked. looking puzzled. Ted replying that he didn't know she was only 12. It's either a lie from Ted, feeling embarrassed, or it's just a weird insight into his mind, not knowing that he took a child. Lynette's family would be one of many families of Ted's victims to have a huge outcry, begging for information about their daughter's whereabouts. But it wouldn't be till over a decade later to where they would learn that Ted had took her. Ted's last victim, before being caught for the first time, would be Susan Curtis, 15 years old, on June 27, 1975. This confession is said to be Ted's last one. He gives it just hours before his death. Around the same time, Ted was having a hard time coming to reality and crying while praying. If not for this very moment, no one would have ever known of what happened to Susan. But with Ted confessing to her death, he doesn't give much detail of what happened. What we do know is that on that day, Ted was back in Utah, walking around a university campus, looking for someone. Ted said that he parked his Volkswagen in a back parking lot, one that never was used much, enough to where no one could hear or see him if he were to lure someone back. As Ted walks around the campus, he eventually runs into Susan, who's having a busy day herself. It's not believed that the two knew each other or ever met before. It was just a terrible coincidence that she passed by Ted at that very moment. Somehow Ted intrigues her, either with crutches, or that he's a cop, or that he needs help with his vehicle. He lures Susan back to the Volkswagen. From there, more than not, Ted probably knocks her over the head with a crowbar, pushing her into the car, and driving off, and going through his usual ritual of what he does. Ted would say that he buried Susan off a major highway, but when he gives what detail he can to authorities, when they go to search, they never find Susan. Still to this day, nothing has ever been found of her. On August 16th of 75, Ted would be out late into the night, around 3 a.m., cruising through neighborhoods in his Volkswagen. But in the middle of that night, Ted's driving around neighborhoods, doing nothing other than scouting out potential victims, where they live, just looking for anyone that might be slipping up and walking in the middle of the night. A car drives up right behind Ted. It's Robert Haywood in an unmarked police car. Oddly enough, is friends with the father of Melissa Smith, who was one of Ted's recent victims. Hayward shines his spotlight directly on Ted's car. In that moment, Ted panics, turns off his lights, and speeds off past stop signs. The police officer hits his lights and chases after Ted. Ted takes the officer on a decent chase to finally being pulled over. Ted stepping out, walking over like he was confused, but soon Bob Hayward pulls his gun directly on Ted, telling him to back up. The officer, Bob, starts asking questions. Ted is polite, dressed in all black from head to toe, asking what seems to be the problem, even though it's in the middle of the night. The officer, Bob, sees that the passenger seat next to Ted is sitting in the back seat. He finds it odd. Ted simply says that the seat is broken and that he needs to get it fixed. With Ted trying to get away, being so polite and very awake, he knows there's too many red flags going off. Ted's talkative, trying to talk his way out of it. Ted keeps saying to the officer that he understands and that he's the attorney himself. As the officer goes through Ted's Volkswagen, he finds the crowbar, rope, ice pick, gloves, stockings, a mask, crowbars, and last but not least, handcuffs. Ted gives the excuse that he's in law school and he uses them in class, trying to explain why he has burglary tools with him at 3 o'clock in the morning. Ted would tell a detective later on in the future that Ted had Polaroid pictures in his car that cops missed. The pictures would be some of Ted's recent victims that he murdered, but took pictures of their body, a keepsake just for him. Ted eventually is able to get rid of them before they're ever found. They arrest Ted on evading, and from this moment, we see the first pictures of Ted being arrested. Ted's been kidnapping, killing, torturing, dismembering, and performing necrophilia for almost 2 years straight. At this moment, his rampage comes to an end for a slight moment. By the next morning, the detectives that have been trying to find out who Ted really is were starting to find clues that the name Ted and an image going around of a man driving a Volkswagen that's been connected to missing women in Washington, and in particular, a young woman named Carol Durant who had attempted kidnapping on her not long ago by a man in a white Volkswagen. But just as Ted is let go for that very moment, authorities keep finding out who Ted is. An arrest warrant is issued on Ted on August 19th, to where he's brought back in on the 21st of August at the Salt Lake County Jail. He's held for several hours. By this point, Ted is in a bad spot. Cops are lining him up with many reports and identifications, sketches that have been taken over the past year. But as Ted is released in that moment, Ted starts to make changes. He cuts his hair off, cleans up, sells his car, and moves into a new apartment, trying to get rid of any evidence. Ted would call Elizabeth, trying to get ahead of the curve before she knows too much from authorities. But what Ted doesn't know is that she's already been talking to the authorities. Ted tells her that this is all just a mistake. It's also in this time where Liz starts to talk to authorities more herself. She almost doesn't have a choice at this point. She does tell a detective that one day in Washington, she went through Ted's apartment, seeing things that didn't make sense, why he would own them. She saw that Ted had crutches, he had a huge meat cleaver, and that he had a suitcase full of women's clothing and jewelry. But as authorities keep going through Ted's belongings and personal history now, they see that most of Ted's belongings are either stolen or what's valuable that he doesn't need, he's already sold. Ted's in debt at this point. When authorities seize Ted's Volkswagen from the man he sold it to, it's when they find the hairs of Karen Campbell and also other ones that they can't pinpoint. In the beginning of October, Ted is put into a lineup with other men. He's behind a glass window, and what Ted doesn't know at first is that Carol Durant is on the other side of the glass. She immediately points out Ted with no question, saying, "That's the man that tried to kidnap me." Even though Ted looks clean, fresh haircut, clean shaven, Ted is arrested right then and there. But this time he would post bail for $15,000 that his parents paid. And Ted's story takes another interesting turn. For a small amount of time, Ted would talk his way back into Liz's house. And unbelievably, Ted would move back in with Liz and Molly. But as Ted is living with them now, he's being watched day and night. That two unmarked cars are always parked outside of Elizabeth's house. Ted, who has murdered at least 25 to 30 women that we can pinpoint at this moment, is back at home with Liz and Molly, cooking, doing the dishes, playing with Molly, playing the role of a boyfriend again. But as Ted is getting ready for the Carol Durant case, he's also about to find out. He's also about to be charged for the murder of Karen Campbell. In the next few seasons of Ted's life, he goes more than 2 years without killing anybody. He's in and out of the courtroom, back in jail, new mugshots, pleading his innocence. He's giving interviews while on trial, gaining popularity, then famously being held in a courthouse, being allowed to study, finding himself alone, and escaping out of a window, to a huge manhunt taking over, being picked up a few days later, malnourished, and simply just shrugging it off. In that time, most of America has learned about the name Ted Bundy, but if people haven't come across Ted's name yet, the next part of Ted's grand finale of murdering will make Ted a household name into the next decades. On December 30th, 1977, Ted has been losing weight and planning an escape for months. Out of a Colorado jail, he's being held there for the murder of Karen Campbell. It's late into the night, not many people working. It's the holidays. Most are home with their families, and the ones that are at work are not paying attention. But it's the moment Ted's been waiting for. He piles books into his bed, and the light fixture that he's rigged to escape out of, he simply removes it and crawls through the ceiling, making his way right outside and vanishing back into the world. His cell going hours without being noticed that he's even gone. Ted steals cars, hops buses. Rumors even say that he made his way to Boston for a short time But what we know and believe to be true and proven to be true is that Ted made his way straight to Florida. Arriving in Tallahassee on a bus on January 8th, Ted rents a room at a local cheap hotel. The next night, he finds a small place in a boarding house right next to Florida State University. It's by no mistake that Ted's living next to a university. Ted simply does what he's always done. He immerses himself into the community. He spends time with the locals, going to bars, going to places where mostly young people are that really aren't paying attention to the news. We know that he steals credit cards, petty cash. He jogs around the university. He studies dorms. He follows women, just what he's always done. Ted even takes his next door neighbor out on a date. When she's later interviewed, she says that she had a nice time and that she had a crush on Ted. While Ted is living his life in Florida, all the while, every law enforcement agency is scouring the United States looking for him. The FBI puts Ted at enemy number 1. It's a huge search. They have no idea where he's at, but Ted is about to make his presence known in one of the worst and biggest ways a serial killer has ever done. January 15th, 1978. There's really no confession or conversations that Ted gives in detail about the sorority murders, what was going on in his mind. But what we do know about that night is that Ted was walking in unknown waters. There's never really a solid answer as to why he did what he did at the sorority houses. Honestly, the simple answer is we never got an answer because Ted ran out of time to even talk about it. But on January 15th, in the middle of the night, around 3 a.m., Ted is walking around the campus. More than likely, he's already pinpointed the locations of where he's going to break in. He knows who's in the houses and where to go. Sadly for all of Ted's past victims, what he's about to do now will put a shadow over most of them, where Ted is about to commit one of the most well-known crimes in American history. Ted walks up to the Chi Omega sorority house. He goes around the back. He sees the back door. The lock is broken. There's also a pile of firewood. He grabs a piece, simply walks in the house. He makes his way up to the room with Margaret Bowman in it. Margaret is sleeping. She never heard Ted come in. Sadly, she would be the first. Ted starts beating Margaret over the head with the log he's brought in. He then assaults her and strangles her to death with a nylon cord. She most likely never even woke up from her sleep. He spends no more than minutes in her bedroom, where he walks out of her room and simply walks into the next door across the hall. It would be the room of Lisa Levy, also sleeping. He crushes Lisa's skull in. He takes a hairspray bottle and assaults her body with it, demoralizing her. He bites her so hard that it leaves a perfect imprint of his teeth, that it'll be used against him in court. He spends no more than 5 minutes with her. It's said that Lisa was actually alive for some time afterwards, moaning, but would soon pass. Ted finds another room. This time there's 2 women inside one room. As soon as he walks in, he trips over a suitcase, waking one of the girls, Kathy. Ted stands over her and slams the log into her face, breaking her jaw. Karen, the other roommate, is awaking. Ted walks over and slams the log into her head as well. Thankfully, a light shines into the bedroom, scaring Ted. He runs out into the hallway, where he's met by someone that's coming in late, a roommate with her boyfriend. Ted runs out of the house and down the road. Police are called within minutes, and the house is swarming. The next house that Ted goes to is Cheryl Thomas. He breaks into the kitchen window. He then makes his way to Cheryl's room and finds her asleep, where he beats her, breaking her jaw and giving her permanent damage. Ted disappears into the night once again. From the attack, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy would die. The other women would survive, but have scars for the rest of their life of what Ted did to them. Ted would steal a van from the school, where 3 weeks later, he shows back up in a Kmart parking lot on February 8th, driving up to a young girl, saying that he's from the fire department and that he needs help. Luckily, the young girl's brother would find her and scare off Ted. They even write down the license plate to the van that Ted is driving, giving it to authorities. The next day, on February 9th, Kimberly Leach, who was 12 years old, living in Lake City, Florida, she's getting ready for the upcoming school dance. She even has her first boyfriend, but sadly, her life would have a tragic ending to the most notorious serial killer in American history. That day, Kimberly, she would go to school like normal. Everything was fine, even making it through most of the day. It was a rainy day, overcast. It was cold outside for Florida. In that morning, what we know is that Kimberly walked from the gym to her home room to retrieve her purse. When she picks up her purse, trying to go back to the gym, from there, she runs into Ted. Ted would make a statement about Kimberly, that none of this was premeditated. He had never met her or seen her before. He was simply walking around the school looking for someone to take. And sadly, as Kimberly turned the corner, Ted was right there. As Ted approaches Kimberly, he says to her that he's a friend of the family, something's happened, and that she needs to come with him, to where she would walk with Ted back to the van and disappear. It's even later confirmed by a witness that Kimberly was seen walking with a man back to a white van. From there, Ted does the most horrific elements to Kimberly. On April 7th, she's found in an abandoned hog shed. Most of her clothes are found next to her, besides her suspenders that are still around her ankles. They can see that the cause of death was from a hunting knife used to the neck. Kimberly's blood would be found in the stolen van that Ted took, and fibers from the football sweater she wore when she was taken were also found in the van. Ted's story of murdering is over, days later to finally being caught in Pensacola, Florida, where he's pistol whipped and famously says as he's chased down by a cop, "I wish you would have shot me." It's hard even decades later to look at each victim's story, their life, what it was, them as a person. They had hopes and dreams, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, friends. Ted not only murdered all these girls, but he killed families too, parents that never recovered from the loss of their child. When Ted took one person's life, he hurt 50 people at least. He's hurt hundreds. Some things in life are just simple, but simple can also be devastating. And Ted was simply a person that loved torture and murder. We can analyze him, dig into the detail of what he is, what he did, and still many things that we'll just never know about or even understand. It was a time in the world that could only happen the way it happened at that time. Ted's story would go on from here, but luckily, he would never take a life from here on out again.